Hello again, this is Joseph Holbrook. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Panama Canal and the other options that were available. So this is the fifth or sixth in a series called U.S. Latin American Relations, and today we're talking about canal building. So let's go to it. So as early as 1826, in Simon Bolivar's Panama Congress, the U.S. Undersecretary of State Henry Clay was discussing the idea of building a canal across Central America. So the ideas had been around for a while. In 1846, Louis Napoleon, or Napoleon III, published a book called Canal De Nicaragua. I'm probably butchering the pronunciation on that. It was also around this time that the term Latin America became popular as an alternative to America or the Americas or Spanish America because of the growing influence of France in the among the Spanish American republics. In 1849, President Zachary Taylor, if you remember, he was of the fame from the 1846 Mexican-American War. He was a general that was sent to the Mexico border to provoke a war with Mexico. He's now president in 1849. He informed Congress that a contract had been concluded to build a canal. The contract was with Nicaragua, however. In 1850, the United States and Great Britain signed the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty, agreeing to share responsibility for the control of the Nicaraguan canal. This meant to keep both the U.S. and the Great Britain neutral in its construction and control. In 1846, President Grant created an Interoceanic Canal Commission that sent 7 separate expeditions to identify the best canal route in Central America. The Grant administration also signed a treaty with Colombia, giving the United States the right to build a canal. Now, keep in mind this means there are 2 treaties, one with Nicaragua, one with Colombia. A French Navy officer, Lucien Wise, was sent to the Colombian province of Panama to identify an appropriate canal route in 1879. So the French are involved, the British are involved, and the U.S. are involved, trying to find an advantage. Wise obtained a concession from the Colombian government to build and operate a canal across the Isthmus of Panama. Wise also brought Ferdinand de Lesseps into the project. He was a French engineer and entrepreneur, and he was famous for the construction of the Suez Canal. The United States continued to champion a canal route through Nicaragua. By the way, this was more or less around the time, or maybe a little bit after the time, that William Walker, the mercenary and filibusterer, was involved in Nicaragua, trying to take it over for the United States. The U.S. President Rutherford B. Hayes was not pleased with the French initiative under de Lesseps, so he ordered U.S. gunboats to the border of Panama and Costa Rica, and he attempted to persuade Colombia to desist with its plans to authorize the French to build a canal. In 1880, Hayes informed Congress of a major policy shift, and he abrogated the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty, guaranteeing collaboration between the Great Britain and the United States. He said the policy of this country is a canal under American control. The United States cannot consent to the surrender of this control to any European power. In 1881, President Garfield approved the policy of President Hayes and unsuccessfully sought to abrogate the 1850 Clayton-Bulwer Treaty. But then, in late 1881, Garfield was assassinated, and Chester Arthur became the president and reaffirmed the Hayes-Garfield policy. So the U.S. negotiated a treaty with Nicaragua, getting exclusive rights to build and operate a canal in return for a permanent U.S.-Nicaraguan alliance to protect the integrity of the territory of Nicaragua. But then in 1884, politics intervened and the Democrats defeated the Republicans for the first time since 1860. I believe bringing Grover Cleveland into power, who was opposed to U.S. expansionism and intervention in other countries' internal affairs. The Freehausen-Zavala Treaty was a result of this change. It granted the United States access to Nicaragua. It also converted Nicaragua into a U.S. protectorate, and it violated the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty with Great Britain, putting the U.S. clearly in charge of a Nicaraguan canal. The new Democratic Senate refused to consider the lame duck administration's initiative, so Grover Cleveland reinstated the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty. Bankruptcy. In 1888, the Republican Party accused the Cleveland administration of watching with idle complacency the extension of foreign influence in Central America. And not long after that, the Republicans returned to power in Washington under Benjamin Harrison, and they immediately did an about-face and changed the U.S. policy in 1889, warning all European powers to stay away from any canal route. No one was going to be allowed to build a canal across Central America except for the United States, in accordance with the Monroe Doctrine. The de Lesseps declared bankruptcy in Panama. Philippe Banovarilla was stranded in Panama. He was the engineer. Construction was suspended on the partially dug canal of Panama, with only about 40% of the canal completed. So the French, under de Lesseps and Philippe Banovarilla, had completed almost half of the canal by the time they went bankrupt. So in his first 3 annual messages, Grover Cleveland, who returned to power after Benjamin Harrison, he never mentioned a canal, nor was it in the Democratic Party's 1896 platform. However, in 1898, the Republicans returned to power under William McKinley. This was the same year as the Spanish-American War. By 1900, both parties had endorsed a government-constructed canal. The only question was where. Washington began to focus on site selection, and even as late as 1900, Washington still leaned towards Nicaragua as the preferable route. We saw in previous weeks the role of Alfred Thayer Mahan in his book on sea power, of developing the idea among U.S. leaders that they needed to have a 2-ocean navy, and they needed to be able to cross from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean quickly. And so this is a consideration. In 1896, the new Panama Canal Company hired a New York attorney named William Nelson Cromwell to promote a Panama site over the Nicaraguan site. Cromwell was an unscrupulous lawyer who played hardball. His task was to convince Washington to purchase the assets of the new Panama Canal Company. Why? In order to bail out the Frenchmen who owned it. This is Cromwell, the lawyer from New York. This is Mr. Philippe Banovarilla. This was among the most difficult lobbying tasks imaginable, for the United States had been committed to the idea of building a canal in Nicaragua for over 20 years, ever since President Grant's commission had reported favorably in that route. He used a Cromwell used a Nicaraguan postage stamp that he sent to every member of Congress to imply that Nicaragua had dangerous volcanoes. If you look closely at the stamp, there is a volcano in the stamp. And it just so happened that that particular year was a bad year for volcanoes in Nicaragua. However, Nicaragua had a healthier climate. It was closer to the United States. It was almost 600 miles shorter, 10% shorter from New York to San Francisco than the Panama route. It had a large lake and a river that could be made passable. About 120 miles of lake river travel with only 60 miles that needed to be built for a canal, which compensated for the fact that Nicaragua was wider than Panama. The Hay-Pauncefote Treaty in 1901 was about 3 months after Roosevelt took office. The Secretary of State John Hay and the British ambassador Julien Pauncefote concluded negotiations by signing a treaty abrogating the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty of some 20 years before and clearing the way for U.S. control over the canal. Along with Britain's capitulation in the Venezuelan boundary dispute of the 1890s, this agreement to abrogate the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty represented the U.S. takeover of Spain's possessions in the Caribbean and the acquiescence of Great Britain to this new profile of the United States in Central America and the Caribbean. The Hay-Pauncefote Treaty was a clear signal that Great Britain had decided to yield control of the Caribbean region to the United States. There is the famous Teddy Roosevelt, leader of the Rough Riders and President of the United States. Roosevelt delivered his first annual message to Congress, "Single great material work which remains to be undertaken on this continent," referring to building a canal across Central America. Roosevelt turned to Colombia. The United States had guaranteed Colombia's sovereignty over Panama in the 1846 Bidlack Agreement. Panama was an isolated outlying territory, and this isolation produced a separatist political subculture and an autonomous economy. The Panamanians attempted separation from Colombia in 1831, and they gained independence briefly in 1840. In January of 1903, the Heron Treaty was ratified by the Senate. Thomas Heron and John Hay were the negotiators. The treaty was unpopular in Colombia. The nation had ended its primary civil war called the War of a Thousand Days. The country's domestic politics were chaotic as in the U.S., as the U.S. had been in the 1960s during the Civil War. In August of 1903, the Colombian Senate unanimously rejected the Heron Treaty, but Roosevelt was outraged. He called the Colombians contemptible little creatures, jackrabbits, and foolish and homicidal corruptionists. That's not something you would hear today. Bad words have changed. I don't know how else to say that. Contemptible little creatures, jackrabbits, foolish and homicidal corruptionists. Okay. Panamanians had already begun to plan the Isthmus of Succession from Colombia, so it wasn't entirely a U.S. idea. However, the U.S. certainly was involved in encouraging it. In October 20th, 1903, the Frenchman Philippe Bonneau-Varilla, who had been around for a while trying to bail out his own assets, brought a declaration of Panamanian independence penned by himself. He brought a constitution copied by him from the recent Cuban Constituent Assembly. He brought a flag proposed for the new republic, designed and sewn by his wife. and a promise from Bonavilla that the United States would prevent Colombians from recovering their rebellious territory once the revolutionists declared Panama's independence. So he arrived bearing gifts and encouraging an independence movement. The rest is history. The USS Nashville steamed into the harbor at Cologne early in the evening of November 2nd, 1903, protecting Panama from the arrival of Colombian troops. Senator Edward Carmack said, "To all intents and purposes, there was but one man in that insurrection, and that man was the President of the United States." Just in case you didn't catch that, would probably be a criticism of Theodore Roosevelt for his big stick intervention in Panama. Roosevelt could not even convince his fellow Republicans that he had acted honorably. In other words, there was a lot of criticism and a lot of disagreement with his actions in Panama. February 1904, the Senate consented to ratification. Here's a picture of the construction going on at in the Panama Canal. 2 years after the separation of Panama, the United States began to seek reconciliation with Colombia. It took tricky negotiations by the Secretary of State Elihu Root in 1909, and then a new Democratic presidential administration in 1913 under Woodrow Wilson to repair the relations. With a $25 million indemnity to Colombia, the canal finally opened in 1914. So that is how the world got a Panama Canal instead of a Nicaraguan canal. I'll just mention that a few years ago there was some talk about the Chinese offering to build another canal through Nicaragua, but that nothing has come to pass on that. Okay, that's Canal Building, and we will continue again next week. Thank you very much for your time and attention.